England, 1976.
They are punk rockers.
Disillusioned youth.
Raw, outrageous and crude.
Anarchy, striking miners.
The new craze, they tell me.
Mountains of rubbish. The winter of discontent.
Worthless, nasty.
Societal decline, no future, chaos.
They're a hero.
Welcome to Destroy, a podcast about how the punk movement of 1976 spawned a cultural revolution still being felt today.
You have to destroy in order to create.
My guest today is someone I've known for a long time. The music packaging he created for all the bands I love, I often love more than the music itself. We worked together for a number of years, and his mentorship and influence is what brought me to where I am today. Please welcome one of the 20th century's most important artists, Mr. Peter Saville. Peter, thank you for being on the show. It's an honor.
That's very nice, Richard. Thank you very much.
I'm so happy we got the technology under control in the end.
We found a way around it in the end.
So, how you doing? Is everything all right?
Good. Everything's fine, Rich. Everything is fine.
Good. I'm just going to jump right in because I know you don't have a ton of time. Yeah. You told me recently, growing up, that you were very interested in modernism. And I wondered whether you would consider punk a modernist ideal.
At the time, punk felt very modern in the sense that it distilled and epitomized a moment in the mid-70s. Mm-hmm. It felt like the very epicenter of nowness. So in 76, it seemed, from my limited perspective, it seemed like the most important thing happening on earth at that time. And in youth culture, arguably, it was. It can seem to have been like a coup d'etat. It was a moment in 1976 where young people basically took back their culture. So-called youth culture was taken back by young people, and in an entirely anti-establishment way. And my generation rewrote the agenda for pop culture. And that obviously had a germination in music, but it extended beyond music, and it encompassed style and identity and attitude and opinions and an awareness to question things, and also an awareness that, surprisingly, you could effect change and that you could be part of what was happening rather than merely a kind of a passive recipient of what was happening. That was the most profound change, to in a way, leave the audience and become part of the backstage. And that, for a period of time, for 12 or 18 months, through 76, 77, 78, it was like the back door of the venue was wide open. And that anybody who wanted to be part of what was happening just had to go through that door and do something. People, as we know, formed bands overnight. Other people took photographs. Other people went and reviewed what was going on.
Right.
Malcolm Garrett and I went and said, can we help visually? Can we be part of what's going on? There was this remarkable opportunity to be involved in a culture which had, by that time, had become entirely commercialized and controlled by a handful of music entertainment corporations who were distributing the product that they saw fit to distribute. And youth culture was on rails laid down by business. And the audience, or the market, were expected to be a kind of a passive recipient of what was delivered to them. And punk upset that completely and reorientated the players, it reorientated the status quo, and it gave young people an opportunity to be part of what was actually supposed to be their culture.
Right.
It was a disruptive 18 months in a way, the storming of the palace and the taking control of the radio station. And then the next question was, how are we going to govern? What, now that we have regained control of pop culture, what are we going to do with it? And then there's that interesting period, 78, when independent labels begin to be set up,
Right.
of which, Factory Records was one of those. And it was a revelation to realize that actually you didn't have to be EMI or CBS to make a record, that you could actually make a record yourselves with a few friends. You could actually get together and make a record and release the record. And this was astonishingly liberating to people. And there was that period of independence. I mean, it's interesting to think about that now, because culture is again now controlled by a handful of global corporations.
I love that analogy you made about the back door being opened, etc., and the kids came in and stormed the building. It's something that I've believed for a long time, is that going back to context, so many of those events, particularly for me, let's say, seeing the Pistols on TV and so on, and hearing what they said, it was inspiring. It was
inspiring and empowering, because they were not unlike you yourself.
Right.
By the 70s, pop stars, they were very remote from the everyday reality of their audience.
Right.
And that was the status quo that had settled. And it was invigorating and such a revelation to see that could be overturned. I asked myself, is this rock and roll?
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that this closeness, this truly rebellious experience, was probably a kind of an echo, a reverberation of what had happened in the mid-50s with rock and roll. And it had drifted off to another planet, and then suddenly punk brought it back again. And also there was this sense of difference to the mainstream. You really felt that you were involved in something that was countercultural, and that you were actually part of it. And that was also very motivating.
Do you think music, or let's say culture, will ever go through that kind of change again? It's interesting you bring up the 50s and, how that came about.
There's been phases of it when kids were climbing to the top of a council block of flats and starting a pirate radio station. And it is a cyclical thing. And there are iterations of it trying to happen somewhere all of the time. But of course, I'm nearly 70 now. You're 50-something. So how would we know? That's the point. We don't know, because it's not us. Somewhere in the world right now, some young people are trying to regain control of their destiny.
I don't know whether it's like Spotify or Apple Music or whatever that's driving that corporatization, but music, even with fashion, everything is now so instantaneous. There's no more expression. I know there is.
There'll be somebody trying to do it differently somewhere. And there'll be somebody trying to challenge that control somewhere. I mean, the remarkable thing about the internet is that it did, in a way, navigate the tyranny of distributors, of record companies, film companies, publishers. Suddenly you could do it yourself, but you were dependent on the network to reach anybody.
So you could go back to Napster, and Napster was very much putting the music back theoretically in the hands of the people. But then that kind of fell apart, and Spotify came along and realized, you know what, we could actually do this legitimately, and everybody signed up.
But I think the difference is in a way, the spirit of intent.
Right.
Unfortunately, business picks up on things, and business picks up on things which are being successful.
Right.
Purely for the purpose of profit, of actually making money out of it. And this is, in a way, the irony. So people do things because they believe in something or because it matters to them. And then it gets picked up and accelerated by other people who see an opportunity for profit.
Right.
And that's where the wheels come off the rails, ultimately. And that seems to be an ongoing cat and mouse struggle. The desire to do something other and to do something different because you feel it's necessary, not because you're trying to sell something. It's just there's a much more challenging environment for younger people now, because the safety net that was there for some period, that has gradually been taken away. Mm-hmm. And if you're 15 or 20 or 25 or even 30, it's not easy to survive anymore.
Right.
Doing something just because you believe in it without really any intent of making a living from it is real jeopardy these days. I think back to 78, 79, when we founded Factory Records, nobody involved expected to benefit from it financially at all.
I'd read how Tony Wilson was constantly calling Paul Morley and being like, you got to put us in the NME.
Tony would have done that because he felt it mattered. But I still feel that the environment of survival was not as hazardous as it feels now. I think the last 30 years have seen that sense of a safety net taken away. It's not easy, and I sympathize with every one of the younger generations. I sympathize with them because being disruptive and rocking the boat is admirable, but you can't just keep doing it.
Right. You go to the 60s, people protesting against war, they have to be willing to give something up.
Yeah.
And I think we live in a society that, for whatever reason, is not quite on that level anymore.
It's not easy. It's difficult. So even when you have a job and even when you're earning something, it's really difficult to make ends meet. So trying to rebel against it is a kind of high risk strategy.
Right.
So there is this urgency to see a return on your endeavor before too long, because otherwise you just can't do it.
The thing I was going to get to was the cultural zeitgeist that was going on then. You talked about Tony Wilson and him founding Factory Records. You have the urban legend of Lesser Free Trade Hall concert in Manchester. You have so many bands coming out of that, and then so many bands like Cabaret Voltaire, The Fall, OMD even, pushing music. Then you have yourself, Malcolm and Neville, all breaking the rules. And I know we talked about punk in many ways being the thing that opened the door, but it seemed that somehow the North captured the spirit.
There's a couple of things that I know about that. If you are growing up in a small city, you're aware of what's happening. You're very aware of what's there. Almost in its entirety, the centers of energy are very evident. And if something isn't happening, you know it's not happening. And so therefore, you can be empowered to think, no one's doing that here, so why don't we do it? So in comparison to a mega city like London or New York, Los Angeles, you never really know what's going on because you think, I haven't seen this or that, but somebody somewhere must be doing it. It's like a mountain or a hill. So the challenge in Manchester is a hill, whereas the challenge in London or New York is like a mountain. And it's so big that you barely have the will to take it on. Whereas in a smaller city, it just seems, let's just do it. You just think, okay, let's do something. There isn't a club or this or there isn't that, so why don't we do one?
Right.
And then the other interesting thing, when Malcolm and I moved from Manchester to London, we wondered after a year or so how we had both been able to gain such success in London. We were like, what? How on earth did London let these two come from Manchester and dominate record cover design in the early 80s? How did that happen? And one of my assumptions about that is that in capital cities, there can be a degree of complacency. Whereas when you arrive in that place from the outside, you're intimidated, it's daunting, you think, my God, I'm going to have to be very special. I'm going to have to really make an effort. I will have to go beyond the call of duty to even get a foothold here. And I think that Malcolm and I both came to London with that sense of challenge and without one shred of complacency at all. And the consequence of it was that we made ourselves noticed.
Right.
You know, it can be very important coming from a place from the outside where you have felt motivated to do something and then to bring it then to a bigger stage.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to jump back to your long-term collaboration with Nick Knight. He is somebody who somehow manages to bridge that gap between challenging convention and making it a business. He seems to constantly always be challenging social norms still. He's a rarity in that way.
Yeah, Nick has creative success within the context of fashion.
Right.
Really, what is photography in fashion? What is fashion photography? What has it been for 50 or 60 years? It is, in a way, it's the imaging of nowness.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a much bigger, more conceptual sphere than it was originally. It is the documenting. Fashion photography, to a great extent, is the highly evident documenting of the mood of the times. And my own work was about the mood of the times. It was not actually about music. Music was the vehicle for it. I mean, very rarely are any of my covers specifically about the music.
Right.
I was interested and I was moved by music, but I didn't really want to illustrate music. The music was the pulse beat of the moment, and I tried to make a visual analogy of that pulse beat as I heard it, saw it. And Nick was also somebody who was moved to visualize the now. And in that sense, he was very open-minded and open to proposition and to stimulation. And I found that I could talk to Nick about all kinds of references from outside. And he would be very receptive as to how we might make that work within the context of a fashion photo. And Nick is interested in image making.
As opposed to?
Photography.
What's the difference?
Photography is recording something that is in front of you. And image making is creating something. Nick's work is actually very concept-based. And that's why he's continuously embraced technology and digital means to create images. Nick's interested in making images, not photographing fashion. And there's a difference. You get more the concept or the idea of something from Nick's picture rather than just a straight record of what's in front of the camera.
There's an idea in it versus here's a new dress or a jacket or a pair of pants or whatever.
Yes, because he can do that. But I think he's excited about the thinking behind something, about the ideas behind something, about the mood of something or where something might fit in a bigger scheme of things. I think that's where you get Nick's attention and interest and his kind of very energetic response to possibilities.
What is the relevance of the work that you created with Trevor Key, the dichromatic work that you created for New Order?
On the dawn of digital, we made this work, and you would look at the images now, some of them, and think, oh, they're the product of Photoshop, but actually they were done prior to that. We actually used a kind of a layering process that was to some extent prescient of what was going to come. We are endeavoring to do a book specifically about that particular body of work because it is a very particular photographic story. There should be a more expansive, more comprehensive book across Trevor's whole practice. But Trevor and Nick are interesting in comparison. Trevor, when I met him in 79, Trevor was very receptive to solving problems. He had developed through that 70s school of still life photography, which did involve a certain amount of problem solving. He was interested in the conceptual end of that. And obviously in the time where everything had to be created in the camera, this entirely pre-digital era, you really had to bring everything together in some dimension of reality in order to get the image. And Trevor was very motivated by being given a problem as to how we might achieve something. And almost without limitation, actually, whether it was a landscape or a still life or some piece of chemistry or fluid dynamics or whatever it was, Trevor was receptive to a challenge. And for a long period of time, I knew what kind of image I wanted. I didn't know how to get it, but I knew what kind of image I wanted for something. And Trevor was very receptive to working with me to find that result. With Trevor, much of what we did was collaborative from beginning to end, but without any limitation as to what the subject matter or the theme would be. So that was wonderful. The dichromats were perhaps the most conceptual and abstract of the work we did together in like 1986, 87. I had a concept for something. And the concept was a flower for the lobby of IBM in the year 2000.
Right.
So basically, a flower image, a floral image, an organic image, for some point in the space age future, that it was the lobby of IBM. So before Apple came to dominate that world, were the epitome of tech. So for this global super tech, in the year 2000, which was like a science fiction date, what would be a flower in the future? How do we represent organic form in the future? That was my conceptual brief to Trevor. And he brilliantly devised a methodology by which we could capture organic form in nature and then create non-photographic but light and color-based images. Mm-hmm. The process concluded in a form of silk screening with light. So it started off as a photographic record of organic form and was realized through a form of silk screening, but with light and color. And that was an extraordinary process that Trevor conceived of.
But why, beyond the idea and the execution?
I was very driven by where things were going. I hadn't gotten up to speed with where things were at by the end of the 70s. I then felt this burden of responsibility to then move them on. And so where are they going? So somebody has to pioneer where things might be going. Mm-hmm. And I did that in the first part of the 80s. I went back to go forward. I referenced the canon of art and design history to reinstate, to bring back into the everyday possibilities and cultural references which I felt were missing. Things that could have been part of the everyday, things that had occurred in our cultural history that could have been part of the now, but were not evident in the now. And as I learned something and learned more about art history, I was frustrated to not see it present and resonant in the everyday. And so the early part of my work was retrievalist. It was the retrieval of possibilities. And then by the mid-80s, I couldn't find what I wanted looking back. It was odd. I remember thinking in 1985 that, crikey, this is where I came in 1965 at the age of 10. That actually I've backtracked through history and it's brought me back to where I started. It's brought me back to, in a way, what could be understood as a last moment of modern, which was the 60s, prior to the kind of postmodern reset of the 70s. And I suddenly thought, my God, what's modern? What's now? What is actually the future rather than the past? And that was where this notion of the flower for the lobby of IBM in the year 2000 came from. I felt very much that the 20th century had been entirely linear and that we understood modern as linear. And I felt that the future would be curvilinear, that the future would be organic, that architecture and form would become more curvilinear rather than linear. And that was my notion about of organic form. How might we record, in a way, the architecture of a flower, for example? The unpredictable, abstract, organic forms of nature. And that was what we explored. We're trying to explore initially with the dichromat process, a way of seeing the form of something rather than the image of something. I mean, it didn't have anything to do with the compilation album substance that it was the cover for. It didn't have anything to do with any discussions I was having with New Order. It was about a discussion I was having with myself about the now and what is now. Mm-hmm. And that question is what primarily concerned me through my life, through my working career. What is the now? What's evident in my work is my own history of learning. They were all things that I was finding out about and feeling an enthusiasm for in 78, 79, 80, 81. I can see my own education in that autonomous work that I had the opportunity to do. The records are interesting in their complete uselessness.
I think there's one aspect of what you're saying which is true, But I will say that there's probably a vast majority of people who are similar in that the record cover is a symbol, a sign.
Yes, totally. It does all of those things. They are immensely powerful.
Right.
But they have no burden of responsibility towards commerciality, in truth. Do you need the record cover to tell you what this musical artist looks like these days? No. Do you need the record cover to tell you what's on the album? Not really, no.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone ever do, or have they ever done market research with a record sleeve? No. And if we think about the amount of concern and anxiety and neurosis that goes into other forms of communication design and the committees which the damn work has to get through, the gatekeepers of even someone's bloody business card, there is so much incumbent responsibility on a piece of graphic work. And with a record cover, at the end of the day, the only thing that the company really wants to know is it done. Because until it's finished, we can't release the record. And that's what matters. So that's what was so interesting. It didn't matter what was on a record sleeve. So therefore, it was a field of visual expression from somebody to someone else.
I think you just undersold your entire career.
But see, the covers were not about selling the music. I mean, as I said, we didn't really expect to sell any anyway. And their complete non-functionality enabled them to become art for their specific audience. It's functionality that defines art. It doesn't have a function. It doesn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, it exists in its own right. And so we can understand the record cover as a kind of playground version of that.
Mm-hmm.
The record cover existed in its own right. It didn't have a job. So therefore, to its audience, it could become their art.
I know you have several covers in MoMA.
There are some works in the Tate now, in the context of art,
right.
And those covers, I'm very proud, very pleased that they were seen appropriate for the nation's art collection.
On what level, though? Coming back to your point around record covers not having a purpose.
As manifestations of art made in Britain in the 1980s. This is a bigger philosophical discussion, but as we know, a work of art does not need to be on a canvas
mm-hmm.
or in a frame,
right,
or even actually in a gallery as such. A work of art is an example of autonomous creative production and being the intent of the artist. So the covers that are in the Tate are actually my intent. So they are ideas about visual culture at that time, expressed in an entirely free and autonomous way. They were ultimately contained within the 12-inch square of a record sleeve, but other than that, they were entirely free-form works, and that is how they passed, ultimately, the criteria of inclusion in the context of art, and that they were influential on the direction of art itself. So they can be said to have been a contribution to the art discourse, if we want to enter that terminology.
Right.
And they were. I know that this was the case because some of those works were highly influential to the next generation of artists. And I know it categorically. Someone tells me that somewhere in the world every week.
Right. Oh, I think it's absolutely true. Outside of record covers for a while, I think you've been creating, I want to say, your own artwork.
That's been a tricky challenge because I was able to function so capably through that medium of the record cover, through until, let's say, the early 90s. But understandably, it lost its potency and its viability to me as a medium for various reasons. My own age, context, changing world, expressing myself through the medium of record sleeve had run its course for me by the early 90s. And so my primary medium that had served me so well, it faded out. Within the discipline of communications design, within my day job as a graphic designer, art director, There was no other equivalent. And yet it was incumbent upon me to make a living. For the last 30 years, I've tried to deal with the professional environment of my recognized career in a way that was not too disingenuous for me.
Have you always considered yourself an artist?
No, I never thought of myself as an artist. If someone asks me what I do, I can't say artist. I always say designer. In this last 30-year period, when confronted with art itself as a discipline in which to function, I didn't know how to do that. I've done some things, but I didn't really know what it meant to be an artist. And I'm still wondering what an artist is. And I did not suffer or benefit from any of the education as an artist. Fine art course is a very particular thing, like any other discipline. And you might think you know what it is from the outside. You press your nose up against the window and you think you know what it is. One doesn't know what fashion is until you work in fashion. The same applies to music industry. A band is not what people really think it is.
Right.
And this applies to all walks of life. And knowing about art and going to galleries and museums and reading art magazines does not tell you what making art is. And it's a very challenging, highly intellectualized sector. And there's a lot to know. There's a great expression, some went mad, some ran away. Basically, some go mad, some run away. It's one of the most perplexing fields that I've ever gone and walked around in. And if you're going to be an artist, be a great artist.
Right.
You know, I'd rather be a great designer than a mediocre artist. And also, it's a continuous learning curve. So maybe my art is my default being rather than anything that I might go and fabricate. So there's what I do for others and there's what I do for myself. And maybe what I do for myself is my art. Because it doesn't look like art to me. But then I could say the same thing about artists whose work I like. It doesn't look like art until they've done it, or until someone tells you it is.
It comes back to that context. It's until you put it somewhere, whatever that thing is, it doesn't take on any meaning.
Yeah, Heinz Steinbeck putting things that he finds on a shelf in a gallery.
Right.
You love it, but if it wasn't in a gallery, would you know?
Exactly.
You know? Hans-Peter Feldman collecting hats. Would you know it's art until you see it in the Serpentine Gallery? You know, so maybe it's difficult to know who we are and what we do.
Right.
But it is a meaningful conversation which I am engaged in. And I hope it has an outcome because I have a vast amount of material. I wouldn't really call it work, but it's what I've done. And it's what I do every day. I just have not had a medium through which to distribute it like I did with record covers. But it's all there. And maybe I'm prepared to countenance the idea that maybe my art was what I did whilst I was thinking about making art.
You've often been accused of appropriation. And sometimes what's ironic is you've then been appropriated, like Julian Schnabel or even Disney taking Unknown Pleasures and making Mickey Mouse T-shirts. But
there is a difference. It was appropriation. That was my practice. The point I was trying to make was one of retrieval and transposition. That was the point. That was the essence of what I was doing, was to say, this is interesting. We should be aware of it. We should look at it, and perhaps we can see it in some other way in the now. That was the whole point of it. It was not appropriation in order to find something to do. It was the purposeful act, an evident quotation of something from somewhere else now brought into this other place.
So do you think Julian Schnabel was doing that?
I don't know Schnabel. I know that he made the painting Ornamental Despair, which was some kind of reaction to Joy Division and the cover of Closer. But that generation of artists, Robert Longo was massively motivated by Joy Division. I mean, many artists have been, and many artists have been motivated by my visual references that I've made. That's different to appropriation in the case of a Disney T-shirt, which of course was just a error of creative management inside a company that can care less,
Right.
other than about its own values and image. I mean, I saw my work as signposts. They were signposts of where I thought things were going. So if I then saw things go that way, it was much as anything, it was a validation that I was right.
Mm.
There's a few acts of fairly blatant copying for no apparent purpose. But in most of my cases, someone will say, why did you copy Eve Klein? I can say exactly why I copied Eve Klein. It's the intent. If someone's just desperate for an idea at 5 o'clock and they've got 10 minutes and they just copy something, then that's difficult ultimately to defend. But it happens. And it happens in the high-speed communications industry that we work in. It's just a way now to sex up an otherwise dull bit of graphics.
It's almost like 6 degrees of separation too, right?
Yeah.
You have in the early 80s the influence of bands like New Order and OMD and so on, and you have the birth of MTV, and then you have the second British invasion in the US, and then you have Pretty in Pink and John Hughes and all of that. Then going back even further, there's this multicolored straight line between 76 and where we are today, and design everywhere. And
it's become entirely ornamental. But we are living through ever speeding era of assimilation. Mm-hmm. Whereas when I started working 45 years ago, it might take months, if not years, for something that came into being in some sort of cult niche to begin to become evident in the everyday. That timeline is now compressed to almost moments. Nowness, hipness is mainstreamed. It can be mainstreamed almost instantaneously. Earlier this year, Brat, a colour on a music release, ending up being discussed at the highest levels of mainstream politics. Okay, that was pretty fast. Okay. I messed with the Cross of St. George and expressed it in different colours on the England national football squad shirt in 2011.
Right.
And almost nobody batted an eyelid or even commented on it, to my great disappointment, because I actually felt it was an interesting sociological moment and platform upon which to express an idea. It came and went without barely being noticed. And yet earlier this year in the UK, when Nike put a couple of colours on the back of the neck of a football shirt, it became a discussion at the highest level of politics here between the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. The timeline now between pop culture and real life is massively closed down. I mean, it is fast. Everything is being disseminated very quickly and therefore assimilated very quickly.
There's also that there's an understanding, there's a appreciation, there's an awareness.
It's a pop society. If I'm nearly 70, which I am, then that is the upper echelons of the establishment, because come 80, they put you out in the field. So my generation are now really the aging part of the establishment. Mm-hmm. So we are living in an almost entirely up-to-date pop society. Every day in the newspapers, no matter whether it's the Daily Mail here or the New York Times, you'll see song titles quoted, used in order to provoke a headline.
Yes.
But, we see them all the time. So that's in serious highbrow editorial. Pop is being quoted in one way or another because we live in a pop society.
It's like the TV show Everything But the Buzzcocks.
But, the FT do it. Every other day in the FT and in the New York Times, there will be a ironic quotation of some kind of pop song title as part of a headline. It's because this is the culture of our Western society. It's a pop society. That's what they've been brought up on. And the resonant moments in pop and fashion are assimilated very quickly. Balenciaga was a rarefied, sacrosanct house at the very height of couture and fashion understanding. And now it's like an everyday quotation on the street. That's where we live now.
Right. I think one of the important things to talk about is the future, and talking about whether that be technology or whatever it is. Where do you see that nowness that you talked about or the future going? What are those signposts?
I quite like being the old guy on the hill now, to whom visitors may come for profound wisdom, but not necessarily for the latest news. My techno-tiredness distanced me from our computers in the studio in 1988, as you will recall. And so whatever that was, 35 years or so ago, I have been fairly removed from technological advancements.
But you're not a Luddite.
I have an answer for it, but it's more the conceptual answer, because I can't give a practical answer because I don't know. So I don't have a website because of indifference to it. I have never engaged with social media. I have no Instagram account. My work is all over Instagram, but not through me. I have not joined in to that digital culture at all. So therefore, I know nothing practical really about it, and therefore cannot make any practical predictions about it. And it would be stupid of me to try to do so because I don't know. And it's fair to say that I don't care. And the last 20 or 30 years, I have cared about something other than delivery systems. Creatively, I have engaged always with somebody on ways of doing things. And I'm interested in what can be done, but not interested enough to the point of learning the program or buying the equipment to do it myself.
Right.
Other questions have exercised my mind. And I do see how our aesthetics and our culture has been massively taken over by individuals who are technically minded.
Do you think that's a bad thing, good thing?
It's astonishingly clever and genius in many ways, and at the same time quite blinkered, narrow-minded, and myopic.
We've all fallen into the rabbit hole, we want to desperately get out, but at the same time, we want to keep going down.
It's very difficult. They've created a situation where it's very difficult to get out, and impossible in many cases. It's a classic scenario, one step forward, one step back. There's absolutely, truly amazing, brilliant things on the one hand, and some truly appalling, life-wasting things on the other hand. So there is a problem with communications design, digital communications design. There's a lot to address and resolve and to do better, as there always has been. So there's work to be done, but it's not work that I'm going to do. With regard to where things are going, this question came up last week. I was in a little forum at a gallery for a launch of an edition, and there was a question about where do we see art in the next 40 years? Someone said, art's over. It's never over. It's usually when you think something's over that something really radical is just happening somewhere out of sight. This is always the case. People are always proclaiming music is over, art is over, politics is over, fashion is over, design is over. And just at this point where you think it's over, there's something happening, because that's where initiative and innovation and change comes from. It comes when things are over. And my little contribution to the next 40 years was to quote the subtitle of a book. I did the cover for Professor Brian Cox's book on the quantum universe.
Wow.
And the title of the book is Quantum Universe. Everything that can happen does happen. Truly, truly profound significance when you think about it. And of course, it describes entirely the quantum condition. It describes the universe, whatever that might be. Everything that can happen does happen. And that's the next 40 years.
There was a quote I read that you said, I don't have much, but I'd rather be Peter Saville than anybody else. What do you see as your legacy?
From the people I meet and the people who come up and speak to me and the people who thank me or criticize me, but certainly the ones who thank me for something imaginatively, I can see in a way.
Right.
Circumstances enabled and allowed me to be me, and for that to be seen, shared amongst people.
It's probably very difficult for yourself to be objective in a question like that, because obviously perception is everything. how you perceive yourself and what you've
Yeah.
done and the impact you've made.
I know I affected the look of things in the world around me. If I go back to 1976 at art college, I wanted to be able to do something that might affect the world around me. That's like an ambition that almost anyone in art college might have. And I did have that ambition.
Right.
And I wanted to be part of the world. And circumstances allowed me to do that.
Is that what you're doing with Johnny Ive?
No, Johnny is an interesting example of something. I described a 30-year period where I was looking for a place, an autonomous place, in a non-autonomous zone. I was looking for freedom of expression in the context of my career as a communications designer. And of course, that was not something that one found. And so for at least, let's say, 20 years, 15 years, it was very frustrating. And I just had to make the best of circumstances as I encountered them. Because I was not granted, understandably and quite reasonably, I was not granted autonomy in all of the new fields of activity where I had to go and chose to go after music, actual world, whether it was fashion or identity design or museums and galleries and, the places where I was invited or found opportunity to do work. But interestingly, particularly over the last 10 years, people of a generation who had been touched or influenced or inspired or motivated in some way by my early work, those individuals became significant or decision makers in their respective organizations. And they then chose to come to me, so diversely from different sectors, to come to me, and because I mattered, some idea of me mattered to them. And they invited me to make work, not to pitch work, and not necessarily to do what they wanted. They were interested in what I would do. So the last 10 years has seen me enjoy certain amount for our sector, for our profession, a very high degree of autonomy or self-informed work, Johnny being one of those people. When he stepped away from Apple and founded Love From, it was his decision to engage with me. He didn't have to answer to anyone. Similarly, Marek Reichman at Aston Martin, head of design at Aston for the last 20 years or more. Marek knew that I'd expressed a little bit of critical concern about the identity of Aston. And he came and said, how would you do it? Now, I've not done automotive before, but that didn't matter to Marek. And Riccardo Tisci turned up at Burberry. Raf Simons, when Raf went to Calvin Klein, Raf said, I want Peter to do this. Raf, he didn't have to convince anyone or answer to anyone. Raf was in the driving seat at Calvin Klein at that time. And he said, I want Peter Saville to do it. And so I did it. And I did not have to answer to anyone except Raf. So that was a very privileged position. I've found myself in just in this last 10 years. So in the latter part of my professional career, it's become possible for me to have a sense of self in the context of this work for others.
It ties into my convoluted question about that multicolored line from 76, the 80s, and to today. It's your legacy in some ways, which is this cultural significance. It's the people who may be, let's say, watching TV and seeing bands and being interested and looking at the covers. And then that, to me, is where that multicolored wiggly line connect.
We will conclude on a quote from Tony Wilson.
Very good.
He would refer to what we were involved in as the art of the playground. Now, when I was 25 and 27, I didn't want to be involved in the art of the playground.
Right.
And so it would frustrate me. But in retrospect, when I see what has come to pass, I realize the enormous significance of the art of the playground.
Right.
Because music, pop, contemporary culture in the form of pop was a universal experience for people, regardless of their backgrounds or their knowledge. So music delivered me unwittingly to people who had not yet decided who they were or what they liked. And music was the great universal connector of people. The people who know my work, they know it because it was delivered around a record.
Right.
And they liked the music, so therefore they tried as hard as they could to like and to understand the visual material that came with it. They wanted to like it because they liked the music.
Right.
And it was delivered to them before they had decided what they liked or who they were. And I am still surprised by how far-reaching that delivery system was.
Mm-hmm.
In the early years, I expected it in the north of England or the UK. I did not expect the reach across Europe, but then beyond that, the reach across the Americas, north and south, and to Asia and Australia. I have been astonished in recent years by just how far that music took my pictures and the extent to which it touched and influenced people, whether they were driving a bus or lobbying for parliament or making art or building buildings or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the playground. It's everybody. And pop music kind of washes over everybody between the age of 10 and 20. Whether they want it or not, it washes over them. They can cast it off later, but you can reach them in that critical age period. And that was the magic of the record covers.
Peter, thank you.
I'm going to go and just finish the day.
My name is Richard Smith, and I'm your host. I'm a filmmaker and art director, and once upon a time I was part of the big 80s. I designed record covers for Depeche Mode, I danced with Bono, discussed art with Mick Jagger, and drank tea with Susie Sue. I also grew up during those turbulent times in England in the late 70s and was driven by the do-it-yourself ethos of punk. I obsessed over bands like Joy Division and New Order and went on to work for the album cover designer Peter Saville. I believe that year, that moment in 1976, when a bunch of foul-mouthed yobs cursed and swore on national television, changed the future of culture forever, and is what brought us to where we are today. So where do we go from here? Will emerging new technologies be the catalyst that tears down the walls of mediocrity, throwing culture and society into chaos and revolution again? We'll have to wait and see. This has been another episode of Destroy. Thank you for listening. Destroy is a Be Right Back Studios production. Learn more at BeRightBackStudios.com. And please tune in again for another episode of Destroy, the Influence of Punk podcast, wherever you listen or download.